picture this. It's Super Bowl Sunday. Your coworker Marcus has been talking about this game for 3 weeks straight. He's got the chip dip ready, the team jersey on, and he keeps texting you, asking if you're coming over to watch. And you just don't care. Not a little. Not, oh, I'll probably tune in for the halftime show. You genuinely, completely do not care. And here's the weird part. You feel slightly guilty about it, like there's something wrong with you for not being swept up in the biggest sporting event of the year. So let's talk about what's actually happening inside the minds of people who shrug at the Super Bowl, and why it says far more about psychology than it does about football. Here's the thing most people miss entirely. When someone goes absolutely wild for the Super Bowl, face paint, custom jerseys, shouting at a television, they're not just watching a game. They're doing something deeply psychological. They're borrowing an identity. Social psychologist Henri Tajfel figured this out decades ago. He called it social identity theory. The basic idea: human beings attach themselves to groups, and then they use those groups as a mirror to define who they are. When your team wins, your brain releases the same dopamine cocktail as if you personally had won. When your team loses, cortisol spikes as if you had personally failed. Think about that. The players don't know your name, but your nervous system responds as if you were on that field. Now, people who don't care about the Super Bowl, they haven't opted out of identity. Everyone has one. They've just built theirs somewhere else. Maybe it's their career, their art, a tight-knit hobby community, their faith, whatever it is, their sense of who am I is already anchored somewhere that sports simply doesn't reach. This is why someone who seems totally apathetic about football might get deeply passionate about, say, a local theater production, or an obscure video game speedrunning community, or competitive cooking. The need for group belonging is identical. The outlet just looks different. So what does this mean for you? If you're someone who doesn't feel the Super Bowl pull, ask yourself, what does ignite that same tribal excitement in you? Because that fire is pointing directly at your core identity values. That's a genuinely useful thing to know about yourself. Let me show you how this actually works in real time. Every single second, your 5 senses are bombarding your brain with roughly 11 million bits of information. Your conscious mind can only process about 40 to 50 of those bits. The rest gets filtered out before you even know it existed. The mechanism that does this filtering is called the reticular activating system, or the RAS, and it works on a simple principle. It pays attention to whatever you've already told it matters. Here's a classic example. Have you ever bought a car, say a red Jeep, and suddenly you're seeing red Jeeps everywhere? They were always there. Your RAS just wasn't flagging them before. The moment you bought one, it became relevant, so it started showing up. The Super Bowl works the same way. For someone whose RAS is tuned to football, who watches games weekly, who has fantasy league stakes, who grew up in a sports household, every mention of the Super Bowl registers as important. The pregame analysis, the injury reports, the odds, the stadium weather forecast, it all lands. But for someone whose RAS is tuned elsewhere, that same information slides right off. Not because they're broken, because their brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do, filtering for relevance based on their existing world. And this is where it gets genuinely interesting. Research from the University of Chicago suggests that sustained attention is essentially a vote. Every time you give something your focus, you're casting a ballot that says this matters. And the more you vote, the more your neural pathways reinforce that category of meaning. Football fans didn't just wake up caring about the Super Bowl, they built those pathways, game by game, season by season. People who don't care about the Super Bowl cast their attention votes somewhere else. Neither is wrong, they're just different architectures of meaning. So what do you do with this? You become intentional about where you send your attention, because you're literally building the shape of what matters to you, one focus at a time. Now, here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. There's a specific kind of social pressure that shows up around the Super Bowl that you almost never see acknowledged out loud. Call it mandatory enthusiasm culture, the unspoken expectation that if you don't participate, or at Minimum perform participation. Something is off with you. Think about the person at the office who says, "Oh, I just watch it for the commercials." Or the one who pretends to care about the halftime show, or the one who shows up to the party, eats the guacamole, and quietly checks their phone while everyone screams at third down conversions. Psychologists who study conformity behavior, going back to Solomon Asch's famous line-length experiments in the 1950s, found something remarkable. When people are surrounded by a unanimous group opinion, a significant portion will publicly agree with that opinion, even when they privately know it's wrong. Not because they're weak, because the social cost of being the odd one out triggers real discomfort. The Super Bowl creates exactly this dynamic at scale. Millions of people who feel genuinely neutral about the game will nonetheless attend parties, wear team colors, and perform enthusiasm because opting out entirely feels socially costly. Here's what's quietly happening in the minds of people who genuinely don't feel that pull. They've either developed what psychologists call a higher tolerance for social deviance, meaning they're more comfortable being the person who says, "Actually, I just don't care about football," or they've built social ecosystems where that admission doesn't come with a tax. Neither of those things is a flaw. One is personality, one is environment. Both are learnable. So what do you do? If you're someone who feels vaguely pressured to perform enthusiasm you don't feel about the Super Bowl or anything else, recognize that you're navigating a real social dynamic, not a personal failure. You're allowed to show up to the party, enjoy the company, eat the food, and not pretend to care about the fourth quarter. That's not antisocial, that's honest. This is the framework that actually explains most of the divide. Psychologists have long identified two dominant modes of finding pleasure and meaning. The first is novelty seeking. The brain gets a hit from new information, new experiences, new stimulation. The second is ritual building. The brain finds comfort and meaning in repetition, in knowing what's coming, in shared ceremony. The Super Bowl is, above almost everything else in American culture, a ritual. The same Sunday, the same structure, the national anthem, the coin toss, the halftime show, the snack spread, the shared memory of previous Super Bowls. For ritual builders, this is profoundly satisfying. The predictability isn't boring. It's the whole point. It's a yearly landmark, like a holiday, that organizes time and creates collective memory. Now take someone who's wired more heavily toward novelty seeking. Repetition doesn't comfort them. It drains them. A football game is, by its very structure, the same game they could have watched in October. The pageantry is familiar. The outcome is uncertain. Yes, but the form is identical. For a strong novelty seeker, even if they intellectually understand why people love this, their brain simply doesn't produce the same reward signal. This isn't a values difference, it's closer to a neurological preference. And research in personality psychology, particularly around the Big Five trait of openness to experience, suggests that people who score high in openness tend to be drawn toward novel, unconventional, or complex stimuli, while people lower in openness often find deep satisfaction in familiar, traditional, or culturally shared experiences. Neither direction is superior. The person who finds profound meaning in watching the same franchise they've followed for 30 years isn't less sophisticated than the one who can't sit still for a rerun. They're operating on different reward architectures. What do you do here? Use this to understand your own pleasure map a little better. Are you someone who feels most alive at the start of something new, or do you feel most grounded in the familiar ceremony of things that keep coming back? Your answer tells you something real about how to design your life, your social calendar, and where to put your energy. Here's something you might recognize. Imagine someone tells you, with complete confidence, that you absolutely have to watch a certain show. Trust me, you'll love it. Everyone's watching it. And suddenly, inexplicably, you feel slightly less interested in watching it than you did 5 minutes ago. That psychological reaction has a name: reactance. It was first formally described by Jack Bream in 1966, and it describes the mental pushback that happens when people perceive their freedom of choice being threatened or pressured. The moment something goes from optional to mandatory, Even implicitly, a portion of people experience a reflexive pull in the opposite direction. The Super Bowl triggers this for a segment of the population not because of anything intrinsic to football, but because of how it's culturally positioned. It's not just an event, it's described as the event, the one everyone watches, the national gathering, and for someone with a strong autonomy drive, someone whose identity partly rests on making independent choices rather than going along with the crowd, that cultural pressure can actually generate mild resistance. Here's the thing about reactance. It's not petty, it's protective. It evolved to prevent people from being socially coerced into choices that aren't in their best interest. The problem is, it sometimes fires even when the stakes are completely low, like whether you watch a football game. So some people who say, I just don't care about the Super Bowl, are being completely sincere, and some of them have a complicated dynamic where the cultural pressure around it has actually made them like it less than they might have otherwise. And you know what? That's fascinating, because it means the collective enthusiasm around major events can, paradoxically, push certain personality types further away from participating. So, what do you do? If you recognize this pattern in yourself, the slight contrarian pull when culture tells you something is non-negotiable, test it. Try approaching the Super Bowl or anything else you've instinctively resisted without the cultural framing attached. Watch it on your own terms. See if what you feel is genuine disinterest, or if it was always partly a reaction to the pressure. Let's bring this home. Not caring about the Super Bowl doesn't mean you're antisocial. It doesn't mean you're intellectually superior to people who watch it, and it doesn't mean you're missing some gene that makes you fully human. It means your identity is anchored somewhere else, your attention has been trained on different signals, your pleasure architecture runs on a different fuel, and your tolerance for social pressure varies from the median. All of those are psychologically normal. All of those are, in most cases, features rather than bugs. But here's the shadow side that's worth sitting with. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person who loudly doesn't care about the Super Bowl is performing their indifference the same way the most aggressive fan is performing their enthusiasm. Both are doing something for an audience. Real indifference is quiet, it just doesn't come up. If you find yourself regularly needing to explain or announce that you don't care about football, that's worth examining. Not because something's wrong with you, but because that energy is pointing somewhere, usually at a deeper need to distinguish yourself or to push back against a social expectation that feels threatening to your sense of who you are. The people who are the most psychologically grounded around something like the Super Bowl aren't the ones who love it the most, and they're not the ones who hate it the most. They're the ones who have made peace with the fact that other people's enthusiasm doesn't require their own matching response. You can sit at the table, enjoy the company, and let people love what they love, while you love what you love, without either of you needing the other person's reality to be smaller. That's not apathy, that's maturity, and maybe that's the most useful psychological insight of all. The ability to let an event be big for other people, without needing it to be big for you too. That kind of internal security doesn't come from being contrarian, and it doesn't come from eventually getting into football. It comes from knowing your own anchors well enough that someone else's excitement doesn't feel like a threat to who you are. So whether you're watching every play this Sunday, or you're genuinely using the afternoon to do something completely unrelated, the psychology is the same underneath. You're a person navigating identity, attention, pleasure, and belonging, just like everyone else. You're just doing it in a different jersey